Meadowlands region in 1999 when I was asked to help the environmental groups review the proposal for the Meadowlands Mills development, which thankfully never was built. But I became very interested in this area as an example of a very damaged landscape that still supported a lot of interesting habitats and biota. And I decided, working with my New Jersey collaborator, Christy McDonald, to pull together the information that was available on the biology of the Meadowlands so that the next group of environmental practitioners or biologists who came along would have this information at their fingertips and wouldn't have to start from scratch every time the way that we did. And that led to a report on the web, on the Baykeeper website, a paper in Urban Habitats, and a number of other things, and eventually a book that we published last June or July. And if you go to hudsonia.org, my organization's website, right on the home page, there's a link to a coupon, some information about the book and a discount coupon. Unfortunately, the hardcover book is very expensive. The ebook is not too bad if you use the discount. So I would encourage you to look at that if the material that I talk about tonight is of interest to you. Okay, what do I do to advance? Thought the right arrow was working before.
Yeah. There you go.
All
Now
right,
it should
thank
work.
you, Sienna. So the basic question that we've been asking after the 2 decades of work in the Meadowlands region is, what groups of organisms do well, or at least persist in this region, and which other ones don't? And is that idea of urban tolerance and urban sensitivity extrapolatable to other urban and industrial areas? I think that it is. It's going to be a little bit different in each place, but that's what I want to present to you tonight, is this scheme of how organisms get into an urban industrial area like this and find a habitat that they can persist in, how they move across the landscape, and how they settle in an area that's suitable for them. So a lot of naturalists and biologists, unfortunately, still think of urban environments as having low diversity of plants and animals and fungi and other organisms. And these are the conceptions or misconceptions that we often find about urban regions in the US, even in some of the scientific literature. And I will say that if you're interested in urban biodiversity, you should start looking at some of the European literature, because the Europeans, in many respects, are way ahead of us in understanding urban biodiversity and urban ecosystems, although there is a growing interest in North America. Urban biodiversity is very important for people in many different ways, and there's now quite a large, interesting body of literature about how urban green spaces and urban vegetation benefit us mentally and physically, as well as support many other kinds of organisms and provide ecosystem services that we need for our own survival and our quality of life. species distribution in the city or in a large industrial area like the Meadowlands depends on several factors. Certainly, some organisms are pre-adapted, that is, they've evolved adaptations that serve them in an urban environment. And one marvelous example is the peregrine falcon, which is a cliff nesting species in the wild, but it now nests successfully on bridges and skyscrapers and other large buildings like power plants. So it is pre-adapted to using cliffs, and there are cliff-like structures in the urban environment in many places. There are also urban climates. Urban areas, for example, are warmer at certain times of the day and certain times of the year than the surrounding rural areas. And there are other large-scale factors that affect how organisms can colonize and persist in cities. Urban biodiversity also depends on the regional species pool, which I'm going to return to shortly, and on the propagule pressure, that is the number of organisms or seeds or other propagules that can come from the surrounding rural areas and move into the urban environment. And finally, the characteristics of the landscape allow some species to cross it, that we call that permeability, landscape permeability or connectivity, and others not. And then organisms also have to find habitats that provide the resources that they need: food, nesting places, some degree of escape from enemies and competition, and so forth. So these two characteristics at the end are key to what's going on in an urban area like the Meadowlands. How permeable is the landscape to certain organisms, and are there habitats that have the quality to sustain those organisms once they get into the urban area? So here are some general characteristics of urban ecosystems or urban landscapes. They are highly fragmented. Connectivity tends to be a problem to one degree or another. That, of course, depends on the species. Patches tend to be small, but often very diverse. Some native habitats are in short supply. Forests and freshwater wetlands are certainly among those in northeastern New Jersey urban regions. And there are unique land uses and landscape compositions, as well as barriers to the movement of some organisms. On the other part of the equation, habitat quality, there often are diverse habitats available. They tend to be nutrient enriched, contaminated, and to have altered soil structure. And the soil structure, it seems, is very important because a lot of the animals are burrowers, many of the reptiles and amphibians and invertebrates, for example. There tend to be more, how does that look?
That's better.
Okay, good, thank you.
It was just kind of only, it was like at your chin.
Invasive plants, that is non-native invasive species of plants, tend to be more common in urban areas. Whether that's to the benefit of the rest of the biota or not depends on a lot of species-specific factors. And what we call the built habitats, so these, of course, are buildings, sidewalks, and other kinds of structures, vary a lot. There are some organisms that use them. Birds, certainly some birds like chimney swifts benefit from structures in urban areas. Chimney swifts actually seem to do better in some urban areas than out in the rural areas in New Jersey and New York now. And disturbances from factors like flooding and windstorms and wildfires, of course, are different in urban environments. So we've very, generally speaking, divided wild species into two groups, urban tolerant and urban sensitive. And there are other kinds of categories that have been used by other ecologists that are roughly comparable to these. So you can see that the urban tolerant species tolerate these small patches, low connectivity. They tend to be good dispersers. They're able to move across the landscape. They tend to be able to use different kinds of habitats, and they're able to put up with contaminants to some extent. Salinization, which is a problem in urban coastal areas particularly, and also industrial landscapes like fracking, gas fracking landscapes are very salinized, and poor water quality. So nitrogen and phosphorus are very high in urban areas. Sulfate tends to be very high. Conductivity tends to be high. These are adverse to some organisms and beneficial for others. Urban sensitive species are those that require large areas of habitat or better connectivity. They tend to be poor dispersers. Many of them are habitat specialists, not all of them, and they're sensitive to these various kinds of problems that we see in urban environments. So in the rural areas of, say, Bergen County, in areas near but not actually in the Meadowlands, there are many different kinds of plants, animals, fungi, and other organisms. So there's a pool of species that's available to colonize an urban environment like the Meadowlands. And these are the kinds of organisms that we're likely to see: urban tolerant species, groups of species that are associated with those habitats that are more common in the Meadowlands, and of course those taxa or groups of organisms that are better studied. And that's not so much a question of what's there as what we encounter when we go out and look. And biologists and naturalists and planners and so forth tend to pay more attention to birds, to fishes, and certain kinds of plants. So there are taxon biases or taxonomic biases in what we learn and know about urban environments. Let's see, is this, can you see the pointer on the screen? I'm moving it around. Okay, so I can use that. So
Hold on the control. I think I set that up so that you'll have control. It'll show us a red dot.
oh,
No, maybe that was
nope,
last. I
not
probably used the other computer last week.
okay, different computer. That's okay. So we chose not to just focus on the Meadowlands district, which is this area that has parts or all of 14 different municipalities that are under the jurisdiction of now the Sports and Exposition Authority, formerly the Meadowlands Commission. We have included the former Newark Meadows, which is now basically the airport and the container ports on the west side of Newark Bay, because those were all tidal marshes and other Meadowlands kinds of environments 100 years ago. And also other peripheral areas like the bluffs and quarried cliffs around the edges of the Meadowlands. And of course at Laurel Hill, the extinct volcanic neck complex in the middle of the Meadowlands, and all the way up Overpack Creek, almost as far as where we are here in Flat Rock Brook, and all the way up the Hackensack River estuary to the Oradell Dam. So this is an area of about 150 square kilometers. It's not precisely defined because we wanted to be able to see the gradients environmentally and biologically from the core areas of the Meadowlands, like much of the district, out into areas that are less densely built and so forth. Some of the major habitats, not surprisingly, are wetland fill and landfill cover, deep brackish waters or waters that are brackish intermittently depending on the tide. Tidal marshes and marshes that are partly tidal or formerly tidal, and some very interesting partly drained hardwood swamps, such as in the Lowson Sloat Creek Park in Little Ferry, and of course the built environment. And there are also many kinds of minor habitats. These are some of them: stormwater ponds, clay pit lakes, rocky dry uplands, and so on. And temporary pools, which it turns out are very important for invertebrates. So we did a lot of field survey work, but we also pulled together as much as we could from both the scientific literature and the popular literature on the Meadowlands. There's some very fine natural history books that have been published over the years by folks like John Quinn and Robert Sullivan. And you know, the criteria for what goes into a book like that is different than what goes into a scientific paper or a scientific book, but it's usually possible to screen the information and confirm or have a high probability of accuracy for much of what has been published in the popular literature. Of course, it has to be looked at carefully. And we also drew on a lot of other information about the surrounding rural areas to give us the numbers of species in the regional pools for different groups of organisms. And then we looked at the proportion of species in each group that actually exists in the urban industrial area of the greater Meadowlands, and compared what's inside the Meadowlands with what's outside in the more rural areas. Here are the actual numbers. These are slightly out of date. The numbers are a little larger now. The numbers in the published book are a little bit larger. These are the actual numbers of different kinds of organisms, at least that have been surveyed in this greater Meadowlands region. And of course, the flowering plants or seed plants are the largest group of species. Birds are the second largest. Some groups, like freshwater mussels, are really absent, despite there being half a dozen or more species of freshwater mussels in New Jersey. They have probably been eliminated from the Meadowlands region by bad water quality, contaminants, and brackish water. Now, if we look at the proportion of the regional pool of species for each of these same groups that has made it into the Meadowlands urban industrial region, this picture is quite different. Good to see you, Carrie. Welcome. And what we're seeing here, as I'll show you in a minute, is a combination of these three things: the pool of species that's available outside the Meadowlands, the ability of those species to cross the urban environment. So that's the connectivity or permeability of the urban environment, which is different for different organisms, and the quality or sufficiency of the habitats within the Meadowlands region. That's what contributes to these proportions or percentages in this graph. And again, the birds are doing well. They can fly, of course, so many of them are able to cross the urban landscape in a way that some organisms can't. And amphibians, for example, are very bad at that. It seems that I don't think I have fern allies on this graph, but the fern allies, the horsetails, club mosses, and so on, are very, very poorly represented in the Meadowlands. There are, I think I've only seen one species of horsetail. I believe there are two that have been recorded. No club mosses. And I don't know about quillworts because they may be deep in the quarry pit lakes where I can't see them. I certainly haven't found them in shallow water. So that's an example of it's not a taxon per se, but it's a sort of a mishmash of different groups of things we call the fern allies that are generally not very urban tolerant, at least in the Meadowlands and probably in other cities as well. It's interesting, in White Plains in Westchester County, New York, not very far from here, field horsetail, which is the commonest species, actually grows in big tree pots on the street. So it probably came in with the soil in the tree pits in that case. And horsetail spores are supposed to not live very long. That may be one of the factors that makes it hard for them to do well in urban areas. So this is another way, I have to confess that what we know about habitat quality and landscape permeability is based to a large extent on the literature on different groups of organisms. So this is a kind of conceptual model. It is not a quantified model, and that is something that Christy and I haven't been able to do, although certainly other biologists could come along and carry this work further. Sorry. But if you think of landscape permeability on the axis on the right here, going from low to high, and habitat quality on this axis going from low to high, at higher levels of presumed habitat quality and landscape permeability, and those are pretty well known for a lot of these organisms, you get a higher proportion of species from the regional pool in these various groups of organisms. And this is down here in this colored response surface, it's a little more easily grasped. So this is a conceptual model, as I said. Don't hold me to all of this, but I think it's thought-provoking, and it's something that we can look at further in the Meadowlands and certainly in other cities where there are enough data. For example, in the United Kingdom, where biologists tend to know a lot more about where the plants and animals are in 5 or 10 kilometer squares, it should be possible to test this hypothesis with different distances from a large urban area like London or Manchester. And this is some of the detail. Let's see, is it possible to get rid of that bar at the top of the screen? I wasn't planning on that. And if it doesn't,
Let me see.
if you can't get it off, I'll just say what's hidden on the
Oh.
text. Oh, wonderful.
wish I had
Thank
known
you. Yeah, thank you.
How did you do it?
So these are some of the urban tolerant groups that that have higher proportions of the regional pool of species. And, you know, there are only a dozen species roughly of turtles in the regional pool. So some of these groups are smaller than others. There are something like 40 or 50 species of mosquitoes in northern New Jersey. And that happens to be a group of organisms that's been well studied in this region and also in New Jersey in general, thanks to Rutgers University. The Carex sedges are very interesting because I think when we started with the Metropolitan Flora List, which Kerry Behringer and his colleagues at Brooklyn, former colleagues at Brooklyn Botanic Garden helped me assemble at the beginning of this study, there were only 4 or 6 species of sedges on that list. And we found quite a few species, but what's interesting is that even though there's almost 2/3 of the regional pool of Carex species in the Meadowlands, they are all very rare in the Meadowlands. They're just little clumps of them here and there. And even a really common rural sedge like Carex stricta, tussock sedge, I've only seen that in, I think, 2 places in the Meadowlands and just half a dozen tussocks in each of those places. It's remarkable. So boiling this down to a proportion of the available species is one way of looking at it, but the other thing that happens in urban areas is even if a species is there, it might be just in these little tiny suitable places like near the base of a large tree, which is where many of the mosses occur. Now I've lost the, there we go.
there we go.
Okay,
Awesome.
maybe I didn't press it the right way. These are intermediate groups in terms of the proportion of the regional pools of species. And, you know, I didn't expect to find any lichens in the Meadowlands based upon my experience a little earlier, I would say in the late 70s, early 80s, in the wonderful forested parks near Montclair, like South Mountain Reservation. At that time, at least, it was almost impossible to find a lichen in those parks. There are more lichens there now because air quality has improved a great deal. So in basically opportunistic surveys in the Meadowlands, we actually found quite a few species of lichens. I don't think the 60 or so species that I was able to collect represent all of the lichens in the Meadowlands, but they're maybe a good summary of what's there. And they give us an interesting picture because, for one thing, there are lichens that are based on green algae and a fungus, and there are lichens that are based on a blue-green alga or blue-green bacterium, cyanobacterium, and a fungus. And the cyanolichens are less tolerant of poor air quality, and there aren't any in the Meadowlands. All the lichens that I've been able to find in the Meadowlands are green algal lichens, chlorolichens, they're called. So that's another aspect of, when you drill down into this question of urban biodiversity, even if the larger group of organisms, the lichens, are in a sense well representative, there are some kinds of lichens that aren't there. Another group that's not there is the reindeer lichens, because they're very complex. They have very large surface areas, and probably they are more susceptible to urban air quality problems. And these are some of the urban sensitive groups. Salamanders, one species that's still here in the Meadowlands, one that is probably not here any longer. The one that's still here, the redback salamander, which is probably the sort of iconic disturbance tolerant salamander, it's a forest species, is mainly in areas that have been quarried where there's rock rubble on the ground that conserves moisture at the surface of the soil and that salamanders like to hide under. So Laurel Hill, which was half quarried away, I think it's siltstone maybe, or sandstone on the eastern bluffs of the Meadowlands in one area in North Arlington, and an area that you probably won't be familiar with that used to be a quarry just on the western side of the wetlands in the core Meadowlands, surrounded by commercial buildings like Lowe's. And that was a quarry. It was called Granton Quarry, Granton, which I discovered in a very obscure geological report. And there are redback salamanders there. And that also happens to have been a very important fossil locality, which is the way that it was memorialized in the scientific literature. So here's a couple of the interesting things that we've found. This was in probably Kearney Marsh West. It's a liverwort called Pellia. This mink was not photographed in the Meadowlands, but I did find mink sign one winter, and I'm not going to say where because I hope there are no fur trappers on the line right now, but I don't want to attract any of the wrong kind of attention to mink if there are some here. These are some of the interesting, rare, or species of conservation concern for other reasons that are in the Meadowlands. River otter, probably here very rarely. They can get into urban areas, but they're very susceptible to PCB poisoning and vehicle caused mortality. Yellow-crowned night heron, which is nested in Schmidt's Woods and perhaps one or two other areas. The Atlantic coast leopard frog, which is not rare farther south in New Jersey and even in the Great Swamp, but it happens to be urban tolerant and somewhat tolerant of brackish water, up to at least 5 parts per thousand, which is about a 7th seawater salinity. That's a lot for a frog, not a lot for us, if you go swimming in the surf. But there are 4 or so populations of Atlantic coast leopard frog. All of these organisms are under a high level of threat for one reason or another in the Meadowlands and in urban areas in general. They do much better out in rural areas. Maddox's clam shrimp, one of my colleagues, Bob Schmidt, Hudsonia colleague, is a fish biologist, and I are very interested in clam shrimps. These are little 5 to 10 millimeter long crustaceans that actually have shells that look like a little fingernail clam, but they're crustaceans, and they live in temporary pools where they have very short life cycles, and they make fertilized eggs that are able to survive the dry period when there's no water in the pool. So in 2001, I found a very large population of Maddox's clam shrimp in about 40 long-lasting rain pools on the gas pipeline service road that crosses the Kane Natural Area, now the part of it that's a mitigation bank. And most of that habitat was destroyed when the road was rebuilt as part of the mitigation banking scheme. I've discovered this spring that there are still a few pools there. I'm going to go look during the summer to see if any of the clam shrimp have survived. There were also Maddox's clam shrimp in pools on the Jersey City Aqueduct, I believe it's called, that runs through Lyndhurst, between, what's the name of the road that goes to the SCA building? Between there and the Hackensack Estuary. And something happened to those pools that did end the clam shrimp population. So I'm not sure exactly, excuse me?
Is that disposal road?
No, this is the big public road that you take to
Valley Brook?
Valley Brook Road. Thank you. I couldn't remember the name. Yeah, between Valley Brook Road and the Hackensack Estuary, and there's an underpass right under the turnpike there. And there was a series of, again, long-lasting rain pools that I first looked at in 2013. There were clam shrimp there, and they're not there anymore. So I don't know whether this was just a case of this sort of quirky rain pool dependent organism going locally extinct because it was too dry for a year or two, or if something happened to those pools, some pollution from maintenance vehicles. I just don't know what the answer is. So, and then we found another species of clam shrimp that we actually haven't been able to identify yet because it requires eggs, females carrying eggs, ovigerous females, to tell what genus it's in. It's either Limnatia or Eulimnatia. In rain pools on, I think it's also a gas pipeline road that crosses the Jersey City Aqueduct, just north of the aqueduct. And I found them with a volunteer in 2019, just before COVID, and have not been able to see them again, but I hope they're still there. So so why should we be interested in clam shrimps? I mean, I don't know who's on remotely on my presentation, so I don't know if you're all biologists and naturalists or not. But, you know, from a kind of distant, somewhat abstract point of view, it doesn't matter whether it's a clam shrimp or a river otter or a lichen. Those are all, in a sense, equal in terms of the certain things, you know, the ecosystem services that they can provide, different from different groups of organisms, but they all provide services. We use all of them for educational and research purposes. They all actually or potentially have chemical compounds in them that may have medicinal or other uses that haven't been discovered yet. You may know that about half of our current pharmaceuticals are either harvested directly from wild plants or they're laboratory analogs of compounds in wild plants. So these things are all important, whether you actually go out and see them or not. And clam shrimps are a lot of fun. I call them charismatic microfauna. I tried to get at some of the factors that are adverse to these urban sensitive groups of organisms with recourse to the scientific literature. And of course, this literature is not, for the most part, based directly on the Meadowlands, but hopefully it's largely generalizable to other urban industrial areas. And you can see from this, again, kind of conceptual table that there are certain urban factors that come up again and again. And contaminants in the Meadowlands is certainly of great importance. the PCBs and heavy metals and dioxins and so on that are out there don't kill everything, but some organisms are more sensitive than others. River otters and mink are very sensitive to PCBs. They don't have to eat very much fish from the Hudson River or presumably the Hackensack River for the females to stop reproducing. So that's one of the urban sensitivity factors for river otter and mink, and probably other mustelids. We don't know for sure. The striped skunk is pretty tolerant. That's a mustelid, but we don't know anything about weasels in the Meadowlands. No one whose voice or writing I've looked at yet or listened to has reported weasels in the Meadowlands, and there should at least be one species, the long-tailed weasels. They're not very conspicuous, but they should be here, and I don't know if something is keeping them out or if people just haven't documented them yet. So here are some of these generalizations that come out of this biodiversity analysis and some of the other thinking that we've done about the Meadowlands and other urban areas like New York City. Another collaborator of mine, Liz Johnson, who also lives in New Jersey, and I, 10 years ago, published on the web a biodiversity assessment handbook for New York City, which some of you may be interested in looking up. It's on the Museum of Natural History website, not hard to find. And there is a link on Hudsonia's website. So we have experience in other urban areas, New York City, and certainly many other cities and industrial areas that we visited in other parts of the country and other parts of the world. So some of these things about urban biodiversity are different and interesting. I see your snake waking up in the terrarium over there. There's a lot of interesting animal life here and inside the nature center. One thing that's striking that reminded me of what tropical ecologists often say, that you can go out and find a whole bunch of some organism, whether it's a fish or a plant or something else, and you can say, well, I'm not going to document this today because they must be all over the place, and then you never see it again. And this seems to be characteristic of urban biodiversity to some extent as well. And when we try to extrapolate or generalize from the Meadowlands to other urban and industrial areas around the continent and probably elsewhere in the world, there are certain features that seem to be common, and I've already mentioned these, but contaminants, water quality, hydrological alteration from here in the Meadowlands, the Oradell Dam, the canals and other barriers or channels that have been created in the water system, salinity intrusion, which was caused by the Oradell Dam, because most of the freshwater discharge of the Hackensack River is kept above the Oradell Dam for water supply. That meant that at some point in the late 20s or subsequently, all the freshwater tidal or low salinity tidal wetlands that probably existed in the upper Hackensack River estuary became more brackish, and so we lost that type of habitat. Soil structure is very different in urban areas. In general, not every little hectare or fraction of a hectare, but that seems to be an important limitation for burrowing animals like salamanders, moles, many of the invertebrates. And another thing that's interesting about urban areas, although this is to some extent true out in rural areas as well, is that in urban areas, it seems to be harder to use the better known groups of organisms, birds, fishes, higher plants, certain groups of higher plants, to predict other groups of organisms that aren't as conspicuous or as well studied. In other words, what we call umbrella species sometimes. So it seems to be that there's more, that randomness, which is a factor in the distribution of organisms everywhere, is a more important factor in urban areas like the Meadowlands. And many of the habitats that look to the human biologist's eye as suitable for a species or a group of species may in fact not be occupied simply because the organisms haven't gotten there, or they've gotten there and they've disappeared because of some adverse factor. So as we go on from here, and we're actually, Christy and I actually are now working on a second book, which is, the first book, you know, is basically what's here in the Meadowlands. And the second book is more analysis, some of what I'm showing you tonight, and other kinds of broader scale ecological ways of looking at the Meadowlands. But there are some things that really jump out to us. We have to look at climate change effects, including sea level rise. We all know that from how flooding in the Meadowlands during Hurricane Sandy and at other times has affected human endeavors, but it also has huge effects on wild organisms. We also need to have broader taxonomic surveys in the Meadowlands and in other urban areas. We've been fortunate in that we've been able to get help from a number of taxon specialists on groups like lichens and mosses and liverworts and sedges and some of the other things that are hard to identify, clam shrimps, dragonflies and damselflies is another example. But now, you know, it's really a wonderful time for naturalists and biologists because there's a crop of amazing field guides and identification manuals that have just been published in the last 10 or 20 years. So there are field guides to dragonflies. There is a field guide to hoverflies, flower flies, that was published a couple of years ago, and many other examples. James Lendemer and his collaborators just published a field guide to urban lichens a couple of years ago, which I think is absolutely wonderful. So we have the tools, and we need to get ourselves and other biologists and naturalists and environmental planners and engineers and other folks who are involved with conservation or destruction on the other side of the coin to go out and look at some of these other groups of organisms more, or at least to use information that's being generated by the biologists and naturalists who are looking. And then the last thing that I want to mention on this slide is a concept that was developed by New York, New Jersey Baykeeper 20 or so years ago, and especially by Megan Callis, who was a staff person at Baykeeper at the time. And there's a document called Brownfields to Greenfields that you can find on the Baykeeper website. The idea basically is, instead of cleaning up the contaminated post-industrial areas, the brownfields, and redeveloping them, let's clean them up and turn them into parks and nature reserves. Because we need, for all the reasons that I started out mentioning tonight, we need more green spaces in urban areas. And this is one way to get them, although I will say the economic odds are stacked against it right now. But if you look at the European literature, the German literature, for example, they pay a lot more attention to the biota of brownfields than we do. And they found that there are many insects and plants, for example, of conservation concern that do occur in some of the brownfields. So we need to be looking at these post-industrial sites, which are rife in the Meadowlands, very widespread, and assessing their biodiversity before we say, let's clean this up and build another Hartz Mountain development project or another wetland mitigation bank, which may be good for some organisms and bad for others. So I'm just going to go very quickly through a few more slides here that that ask another question, which is not what's there and how do we find what's there, but what do we do with it from a conservation point of view? And wetlands, and especially marshes that are tidal or formerly tidal in the Meadowlands, have attracted the great bulk of the conservation attention and wetland management attention. And that much of that wetland management, whether it's in a mitigation project or a mitigation bank or just a wetland restoration project, has been based on this paradigm. Spray herbicides on Phragmites because it's a non-native subspecies, which indeed it is in the Meadowlands. Usually that's a glyphosate-based herbicide. Sometimes it's another herbicide like imazapyr. They're all extremely toxic, not just to plants, but to most kinds of animal life. And I just drafted an article that will be in the forthcoming issue of News from Hudsonia, which will be up on the Hudsonia website sometime this summer, reviewing the toxicology of herbicides from a biodiversity point of view. And it is horrifying. So I'll just leave you with that. And you can actually go look at the literature yourself. It's very accessible. All you need to do is open up Google Scholar and look up herbicide toxicology or glyphosate toxicology. Now, some of these wetland management projects also recontour the soil surface to create or alter tidal creeks to try to make them more natural. Many of the tidal creeks were straightened for agriculture or mosquito control or flood control. And in some cases, the material that's dredged out of these de novo tidal creeks is used to build islands. They're called wildlife islands. Like anything, they're good for some species and not others. The ones that I've looked at seem to be fairly low in diversity and habitat quality. I'm not going to say that's the final word on them. I understand from Brett Bregan, who recently retired from SCA, that they are used by migrant birds in spring quite a bit. So this is the current habitat management paradigm, and I think and I hope it is changing slowly as everyone learns more about the Meadowlands and about herbicides and about wetlands of various kinds. There are some benefits to this way of managing marshes. It seems to be good for ducks and shorebirds, for example. But it results in a net loss of wetland, in many cases in toxicity, sometimes in toxicity from legacy contaminants in the soils that are remobilized. That's a very tricky business where you have contaminated estuaries and contaminated wetland soils. And it almost certainly increases marsh loss or or potential marsh loss to sea level rise, because Phragmites, for all the things that people hate it for, is probably the best brackish tidal marsh plant and freshwater marsh plant for building and stabilizing soils. In some freshwater marshes, that's not beneficial to certain breeding birds and so on, but on the coastline and in tidal marshes, it's very valuable, and it's something we need to pay more attention to. So there are alternatives. They need to be experimented with. You can look at things that have been done in other parts of the world, and even a little bit in New Jersey and New York and Connecticut, and get some ideas about how urban wetlands and urban non-wetland areas, urban uplands, can be managed for the biodiversity that's already there, which is in many cases persisting or thriving, and potentially, if we get it right, for other species that are not here now in the Meadowlands, that it might be possible to create quality habitats for. But there are some species that just isn't going to work for. And, you know, Atlantic white cedar, there have been several attempts to plant it in the Meadowlands because it was an important tree and an important type of vegetation here 100 years ago in the freshwater wetlands. But it's sensitive to salinity, deer when it's small, fire, and high nutrient levels, which basically says this is not an urban tolerant species. So there may be a few little places where, you know, there's, where was I? Teaneck Creek Conservancy. There's an area way in the upstream end of the Conservancy in a very sheltered area where some Atlantic white cedars were planted about, I can't remember, it was 10 or 20 years ago, and there are still half a dozen of them, large sapling sized trees that are doing pretty well. So there may be little pockets, but there are some species that you really can't depend on to thrive in areas like this. And we know enough about many of these species now to be able to predict that. You know, I can say from the literature on wild rice, which also was very abundant in the Meadowlands 75 or 100 years ago, that it's a lousy bet for trying to establish in the Meadowlands now, because it's very sensitive to poor water quality, to sulfate, for example. But there are plants and animals and fungi that are doing well here, and we should be able to take our cues from what we see out there, instead of just saying, let's go in and remake this into something that in our ideal sense is what we would like to see here. Okay, so this is where I'm going to end, I think. These are the three principles that I like to bring up about nature management, whether it's managing an invasive plant like non-native Phragmites, whether it's managing a rare species like Maddox's clam shrimp or the peregrine falcon or Atlantic white cedar, which is not rare farther down the coast, but it's not really doing well in most of its range. Management has to be site-specific. Every Phragmites marsh, every diabase outcrop like we see here at Flat Rock, every temporary pool, every forest patch is different than the next one over. So you can't say, this is what was successful in, you know, Teaneck Creek Conservancy, let's go do it in Kearney Marsh and we know it's going to work, because we really don't know that. Management has to be goal directed. In other words, you have to know what you want to get out of the area and what you're aiming for, because one group of what people call stakeholders, it's kind of an odd stakeholder to me sounds like someone who wants to kill a vampire, but it means something quite different in the environmental planning world. Different groups of stakeholders have different goals, and what just to give a sort of obvious example, what a duck hunter wants is different from what an orchid fancier wants, someone who likes wild orchids. And there, by the way, are no wild orchids in the Meadowlands, which is, except for the one introduced orchid species that we have, the helleborine. And I've only seen that once in the Meadowlands. Helleborine, Helleborine. I think it's a British name. So you have to know what you want, and you have to think about the potential conflicts, not only between different stakeholder groups, but different species in the wild or different habitats. And of course, what we want to do needs to be informed by current scientific research. And a lot of, unfortunately, and this is the fault of scientists like me, as well as non-scientists, a lot of research from the last 10 or 20 years just hasn't filtered down to people who are making the management decisions, the wetland mitigation decisions, the permitting decisions, the restoration and conservation decisions. So that's one of the things that Hudsonia considers very important, and a great deal of what we do at Hudsonia is take information either from our own field studies or from work that other scientists and naturalists have done, and turn it into information which we then take to environmental professionals in land trusts, in municipal agencies, in state and federal agencies, on private estates. And we use this information to educate, to train, and to provide technical support to people who are doing conservation and management decision-making. And that's really what Christy and I are trying to do with our work in the Meadowlands and with our books. And we hope that they will be useful to you and to many other people here and also in other urban areas. So these are some of the funders and other kinds of supporters that have helped our work in the Meadowlands. And now if everyone out there is still awake, we can see if there's some questions or comments. I don't know how many people are online, Sienna?
Currently, we have 8 viewers, but we actually were up to 10.
Okay, well, that's good. So what do you think?
So we do have a few questions that have come in while your presentation was going. So first we have Pammy, who asked why there were so few reptiles and amphibians in the pool of species available versus the higher portion of reptile amphibians in the Meadowlands. It was percentage graph. It was further back in your presentation. They said that they're trying to figure out why the number of reptiles and amphibians is lower in the whole area but higher in urban areas.
Yeah, well, it's higher outside the urban area.
Right.
Let me see if I can remember the numbers. Northern New Jersey, rural northern New Jersey, probably has about 60 or so species of reptiles and amphibians. That's not exact, but it's pretty close. And amphibians, salamanders and frogs are in general not urban tolerant. So we have one frog that's doing well locally in the Meadowlands, the Atlantic coast leopard frog, and very locally, bullfrog, green frog, American toad. There used to be several other species of frogs and probably several salamanders. I think salamanders Well, amphibians are also very susceptible to contaminants, and reptiles are too, even though they don't have permeable skin. Reptiles and amphibians worldwide are not doing well. If you look at the numbers of species that are endangered, threatened, or somewhere of conservation concern. So they're susceptible to contaminants, to hydrological alteration. Many of them are sensitive to salinity, which is an issue in coastal cities. I hope I've answered that question.
So if you have any follow-ups, I'll let you know.
I should mention that reptiles and amphibians are also very susceptible to road mortality. So they have trouble crossing highways and railroads, and they also dry out quickly. Many species do.
So even though there's like habitat available, they just can't get there or it's too contaminated.
I
could you
couldn't
say that
hear.
one more time? I think it came a little
I
louder.
said, so even though it seems like there might be good habitat in the urban area, it's too contaminated or they just can't get there because they have to travel over roads or go through areas that they just wouldn't be able to survive in.
Can you summarize that? I didn't.
I think they were trying to say that, yeah, we're gonna try to turn up our volume here so we can hear you.
Okay.
But I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Pammy, but I believe they're saying that, that they aren't able to, that the reason that they are, not as prevalent in urban areas is because of those contaminants and those roadways.
Yeah.
The connectivity, and they're not able to make the distance to even like the park where it would be safer.
Yeah. Yeah. The highways and railroads and even the estuary itself are a barrier for small terrestrial animals. And as far as the habitats are concerned, you know, you see species like the snapping turtle, which is a kind of super generalist, and it isn't invulnerable, but it's very tolerant of contamination, different kinds of aquatic habitats, and so on. And that's the reptile species that's you're likely to find in urban areas, including the Meadowlands and including here at Flat Rock Brook. Today I saw, well, I didn't see, I know there are snapping turtles here because Rosetta told me, and there are red-eared sliders and I think another introduced species of turtle in the quarry pond, yellow-bellied slider. Okay, so those are very urban tolerant. They're from pet store animals that have been discarded when they got too big for the living room. Unfortunately, they're all over the United States now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're not happy about it. They also had another question. Does this work show that there is some hope that we may be able to help facilitate migration of species to help them adapt to climate change, perhaps by moving species to habitats they will be able to survive in?
Well, I think the answer to that is partly yes. It hasn't been done very much yet. It's very tricky for two reasons. One is that it's species specific, like everything else that I've been talking about. And also because in general, translocating an animal population is prone to a lot of problems. It's very hard to do successfully. There's a very interesting historic example. Some of you may remember the Tellico Dam that the Tennessee Valley Authority wanted to build on one of the major rivers in the Southern Appalachians. And yes, there was a very rare fish, an endangered species called the snail darter in that stream. And it was predicted that this population would go extinct when the dam was built. There was some translocation of snail darters done that was highly successful, much to the surprise of the fish biologists who were involved. So sometimes this works really well. It works better with species that we know more about. That happened to be a species that wasn't very well known. There are dozens of species of darters in coastal plain and southern waters of the United States, and most of them haven't been studied very much. So it's easier to translocate some species than others. And there's a very interesting kind of hot controversy now among conservationists, biological conservationists. Should we be doing what the audience member asked about? Should we be moving plants like redbud, which is native here or just a little farther south? Not sure. Yeah, somewhere in New Jersey. But it does really well here in the Meadowlands region, and even up where I live in the mid-Hudson Valley, about 100 miles north of here. So we can assume that redbud and sweet gum and some of these other, really tough urban tolerant trees that people plant that do well in their yards and sometimes on streets if they're, not high traffic streets, that maybe we should be helping those species move north as the climate warms. I can't give a sort of generalized answer to that. I think it's a very interesting question. I think it's probably something we'll end up doing successfully with some species and not others. And there's also the issue that, well, maybe when we move something, it'll become invasive.
Right.
And could harm other organisms of conservation concern.
Yeah, a follow-up question, actually, I realize that's part of the same question, is that, or that maybe nature is more resilient than we realize. So I feel like that would kind of lead to.
Yeah, well,
not knowing if it's in,
yeah.
it might be.
Part of nature is very resilient, and that's the part of nature that we see in the Meadowlands and in general in other urban areas. But and that part of nature is very important for one thing, because people who live in urban areas and can't easily get out into rural areas to see nature, that see nature mainly in urban green spaces, those are the species that those people see, that most of us see. So that's very important because that constituency, if you will, the people who live in the city and spend most of their time in the city and whose experience of nature is mainly in urban green spaces, that's a form of conservation. They can appreciate that we have those green spaces because someone preserved them, someone kept them from being built on or turned into, a street or a railroad or an airport. The Great Swamp, again, as many of you will remember, was proposed to be a third major New York City airport in the 60s, I think. And we are all very fortunate that environmental groups and many other conservation-minded people rose up and said, no, this is not an appropriate place to have an airport. We need it for biodiversity. We need it for ecosystem services. We didn't have that term in the 60s, but we knew the concept and what it meant.
And we also have, so the same person, Penny,
Okay.
said, can Phragmites be used proactively as either stormwater cleaning and or extracting excess nutrients from some waters where HABs may be a potential problem?
Yes, absolutely. There's a huge amount of research and also
And then they said, sorry for so many questions.
application of this, of the value of Phragmites, particularly non-native Phragmites, although potentially also the native subspecies, in removing nutrients and metals and some other contaminants from surface waters. And it's being applied in hundreds of wastewater treatment plants all across the continent and all over Europe and China and other places. That's a very managed kind of industrial limited application of the ability of Phragmites to take up nutrients and contaminants. But it illustrates that the potential is there to use it in a less controlled kind of situation if it's a situation where you aren't going to be concerned about non-native Phragmites spreading and altering a habitat that we need to be different than a Phragmites marsh. So I'll give you an example. In central New York, and I think there are areas in New Jersey like this as well, there are marshes, basically cattail marshes, where there's a mixture of patches of cattail and patches of shallow open water. And these are the marshes where the black tern breeds and some of the other marsh birds. The pied-billed grebe is another one. And when those marshes are highly invaded by non-native Phragmites, they no longer serve as breeding habitat for certain birds. There's another example from Ed McGowan's work in Harriman Park in Orange County, New York, not far from here, where shrub swamps of a certain kind are supporting the golden-winged warbler, which is a species of great conservation concern in New York and New Jersey, and probably everywhere. When those shrub swamps, according to Ed, I haven't seen this myself, when they're colonized by Phragmites to a certain density, they no longer serve as breeding habitat for the golden-winged warbler. So that may be a situation where you really don't want Phragmites. And what we need to do is to develop site-specific management techniques that are not toxic to other organisms, where we can say, look, let's keep this particular wetland a non-Phragmites habitat, but let's let Phragmites thrive in the coastal marshes that are eroding from sea level rise, or the nutrient-loaded rivers and tidal wetlands like Piermont Marsh in the lower end of the Hudson River estuary, where we really need Phragmites to not only anchor the soils, but also because it's one of the few plants that can thrive in that very, very high nitrogen environment.
And we have a person just said, Tammy just said, thank you so much for answering my questions. I'm always just so curious. This is interesting stuff.
Okay, well, Tammy or Pammy?
Tammy.
Pammy, look at hudsonia.org. You'll find more things that are of interest to you, and you might want to sign up to receive our news from Hudsonia in the mail twice a year.
Yeah, definitely check that out.
And I have the most recent issue over here on the table. Well, that isn't going to.
If you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll leave them with you, and someone could. Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
So anybody who's watching, if you come on
Yeah.
by, we have a limited amount, so while supplies last. But you can come on by and pick up your copy. And then we also had somebody who just wanted to know what that field guide for dragonflies that you were talking about was.
Well, there are two that I would recommend. There's one for New Jersey. It's called the Dragonflies and Damselflies of New Jersey, I think.
Yes,
by-
somebody when we were at, I feel like this was a couple of years ago, we were at Angie, somebody had recommended.
I'll check her out.
Yeah, I think the senior author's name is Bangma, B-A-N-G-M-A, if I remember correctly. The one that I use in New York, which is also very good, it's published from Massachusetts, is, I have it in my car, which is going to help me remember the title. it's published by one of the state agencies in Massachusetts. And if you go to the website bookfinder.com, which is a wonderful site to compare prices on both used and new books, and you just look up Dragonflies, Massachusetts, you'll find it. It's like a $20 book. It's field guide size, and it's really excellent. Both of those books are excellent.
And here at Flat Rock, we have a fair amount of field guides in our repertoire. I don't see one specifically on like a whole book on dragonflies, but I did find this handful of at least. So got some resources as well. Actually, there's
My email address is on the screen now, as well as the URL for the Hudsonia website right here. So you're more than welcome to contact me if you have questions that I can't answer right now. That's a nice little quick guide.
yeah, I was gonna say, this
uh-huh.
is actually, it's
Okay,
pretty detailed, actually.
yeah, Northeastern.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a
so-
good starting point.
Just point this in
Okay.
front of the camera so that anyone watching can feel free. This is from Massachusetts Audubon. So
Okay.
it's northeastern, so it's not New Jersey specific, but
Eric, I couldn't find your discount coupon for your book.
I will send it to you,
Okay.
and you can share it with it.
Yeah, we do, but. it's
Yeah.
somebody else.
Right. Well, unfortunately, it's an expensive book, so the 30% discount is important. And it's been published both as a hardback and an ebook. And the ebook is a lot cheaper than the hardback. Yeah, hardback. Yeah. Yeah, it's published by Lexington Books, which is a scholarly publisher, and it gave us the opportunity to publish a long book for a somewhat specialized audience, which many publishers really can't do.
all right. Well, that seems to be all the questions that are here right now. Let me make sure I'm missing. So I believe that's all the questions we have today, unless anyone in person would like to ask any questions.
Right. Well, thank you, everyone. I can't see your faces, but thank you for joining in, and let me know if you have thoughts about anything after tonight. And I hope I've generated an interest in both the Meadowlands and in Hudsonia, and of course in Flat Rock Brook Nature Center.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Yeah.
And thank you all again for your attendance in our Importance of Urban Green Spaces lecture series, those of you who have joined us in person, and those of you online. Once again, very much appreciate it. Just a reminder that this is the 50th anniversary year of Flat Rock Brook. So yeah, so we wanted to make sure that everybody understood why it's important to have spaces like this. We might not be as urban as, say, Jersey City, but we're residential urban enough that it's an important place as well. And we want to make sure that everyone always supports those kind of places. So I want to thank you all again for joining us on this lecture series. As a little personal note, this is actually my last week at Flat Rock. So thank you all for supporting this lecture series and any of the ones I've done in the past. I hope that they will continue in the future, and I'm sure that they will. And thank you all for wonderful years. All right, bye everyone. Have a great night. I got it.
See, I've never heard you talk. Never heard you talk before.
Yeah, right. Well, thank you for a few minutes.
And yes, I will send out an email with the discount code to everyone that was here tonight. All right, good night.
When I was teaching in high school, I went online, because we were right at County Marshall first seminar.